nice to be with you all today. This is really a story about how us as a regional provider and the cities that we serve have been able to work with the regulators to be able to continue to provide reliable, safe, and affordable services to the North Texas area. So happy to be here and share it with you. If you look a little bit about who the district is, who North Texas Municipal Water District is, we're a regional provider of three main services: water, wastewater, and solid waste. The map kind of on the left shows in green kind of our service area for water. You can see that kind of the bottom left county is Dallas. So a majority of our service area is in Collin County, Rockwall, Kaufman County kind of area. We serve up to 90 communities on any given day and 1.6 million people for water services. And that happens through 6 water treatment plants. We also have wastewater services, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail about here in a moment. There we have 14 wastewater treatment plants and about 250 miles of large diameter interceptors. And we also, on the solid waste side, have 3 transfer stations and a landfill up in the Melissa area that processes about 800,000 tons per year of solid waste. So we provide these services to our member and customer cities and have been in existence since the 50s. Talking a little bit more detail about the wastewater service area, we've got 3 systems. The first 2 are on the treatment side of things, and the first one is our regional wastewater system that has 4 treatment plants with a total of 118 million gallons a day of capacity. In addition, we've got sewer system, 10 plants there with a total of 34 MGD. As we get into some of the subsequent discussion, there's a little bit of a distinction between the regional system and the sewer system plans. So you might kind of take note that the regional plants are primarily the larger ones and have capacities up to 56 million gallons per day. On the conveyance side, we take care of mainly the large diameter interceptors. So the communities that we serve primarily have the small diameter retail connections, and then they discharge into our larger lines. There's 4 primary systems that transfer those flows into the treatment plants. So this is the third of the wastewater systems, the conveyance system. The largest portion of our interceptors are kind of in the Collin County area. Up in the Richardson, Plano, McKinney, Frisco type area, and on the north part of the Metroplex. So I think we all in this room know that what we do in the water industry is really critical for 3 main purposes. So we really are going to talk the rest of the time about the things that we're doing to make sure that we're providing those services to be able to continue to protect public health, protect the environment, and sustain economic development. The reality is a lot of our infrastructure, particularly on the wastewater side, is buried infrastructure. And you all here at ASCE know very well that our report card isn't as good as what it should be on many components to our infrastructure, and on the buried infrastructure side, it's the same. So there's some areas of the country, including our area, that sometimes the wastewater systems don't do what they're designed to do, and we have sanitary sewer overflows. Some of the common causes of those are aging infrastructure or things like grease going down the drain when it shouldn't be. Also, there's times when inadequate capacity occurs or there's poor construction methods. On the wastewater side of things, you all know this very well, I'm sure. During times of peak flow, when we've got rainfall events occurring, it's not uncommon that our treatment plants are seeing 4 times the flow that they do on a normal day, and there's parts of our system, our collection system, that may see up to 15 times what it does during a normal day. So some of those really peak flow conditions cause some issues out in the system to allow us to do the things that we need to do to properly convey and then treat those wastewater flows. So this is something that's been on the Environmental Protection Agency's radar for decades. So this is a map that's straight off of their website that where they're talking about what their strategic initiatives or their enforcement initiatives are for the EPA. One of those initiatives is keeping raw sewage and contaminated stormwater out of our nation's waterways. So this is a map for sanitary sewer systems that basically shows the areas of the country that they've done inspections and where those folks are in compliance or they may be in enforcement. So for the first couple of decades they were really looking at this, they were primarily focused on combined systems where you've got stormwater and wastewater combining into a single system. We're very fortunate in this part of the world that we don't have combined systems, but we do still have issues with the sanitary sewer system. So over the last decade or so, they've honed in, they've kind of gotten through most of the CSOs and have been focused on the separate systems and are continuing to look at that. This is something that the ASCE is very in tune with. There was recently, the most recent issue came out on America's infrastructure. The overall score is a D+ now. It's holding steady at a D+. Back in 2013, that's what it was as well. From the national perspective, wastewater actually went from a D to a D+, so it actually went up a little bit in the last few years. Maybe because of some of the activities that have been going on with the regulators. Looking at the Texas scorecard, there's a number of different components here. Aviation's at a B-, bridges at a B, dams D, drinking water D+, flood control D, highways and roads D, and wastewater is also a D. And as you kind of read through this, which I won't do the full thing, but it does talk about the primary cause of the problems that we have for our impaired fresh water sources in Texas is attributed to sanitary sewer overflows. So even within the industry publications that we've got within the engineering industry, we're recognizing that there's some issues there. So what are some of the key solutions? This again is from the ASCE report, and it basically says we need investment, we need leadership and planning, and we need to prepare for the future. And so that's what really we're going to talk about as we go through the rest of this presentation is how for the North Texas region, how are we responding to some of the EPA's concerns, which are common with the concerns that we put together in this ASCE report, to invest, to provide the leadership and planning, and to prepare for the future. So this is another graph that's off of the EPA's website, and basically what they were trying to do is through the end of fiscal year 2016, they wanted to look at every sanitary sewer system in the United States, which totaled 1,103 of them, which produced more than 10 million gallons per day of wastewater, or clean water, actually. So kind of a side note, and what other industry do you know of that's named for what comes in as raw product and not what goes out as finished product? So we call it wastewater, but actually what we produce is clean water. So kind of a side note. But anyway, so they were focused on the larger utilities that produce more than 10 million gallons per day. In 2013, they had looked at 828 of them, and they were in good shape, but there were 94 at that time that were in enforcement. So back at the end of, during 2016, there were still just a handful that they hadn't looked at, and we were one of those that wasn't yet accounted for on that chart. So back in 2014 and 2015, the EPA did inspections of the regional wastewater system members and the district. So if you kind of think back a few slides to how we had two different categories of our wastewater treatment plants. There was the category of the regional wastewater system and then the sewer system. The column on the left is the members of that regional wastewater system. So we've got 12 members of that system, and they contribute flows to a treatment plant that is greater than 10 million gallons a day. So it fell into this enforcement initiative for EPA. The cities that contributed flows to those smaller plants or were customers of that regional system were not inspected by the EPA in 2014 and 2015. So at the time of the inspections, we tried to kind of start figuring out, okay, where is this going to go? Where are we headed? And what we were able to determine is there was three basic outcomes that could occur. The most preferred outcome was that the EPA, following our inspection, would send us a letter and basically say, You guys are doing a good job of correcting the items that were identified as deficiencies. We want you to continue working together as a region to address these items, and we'd like to see you continuing down the path of CMOM, which we'll talk about in a moment. The next outcome was an administrative order, which would be administered actually by EPA Region 6 that's based here in Dallas. Those are typically short documents, and they're tailored to specific situations, and they're individual agreements between the EPA and the district, or the EPA and the city. And in those, we would expect that they would require CMOM implementation, and they would want collaboration with the region. The least desired outcome was a consent decree. Consent decrees are enforcement that are negotiated with EPA out of Washington, D.C., and the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. They're very long, detailed documents, typically more than 100 pages in length, and they're very expensive to implement and have very little flexibility. Within the constraints of a consent decree, you have to go to a federal judge even to change the schedule of a single project. So we desired a regionally developed solution rather than a consent decree solution. This map shows a number of utilities around the country who have received consent decrees over the last 10 or 15 years. And you can see that those are often in excess of $1 billion. And we knew that that would be a difficult thing for our ratepayers to have to absorb. So if you kind of look at what's even going on here in Texas, San Antonio just a few years ago negotiated a $2.6 billion consent decree down in Saws. The city of Houston has ongoing negotiations in progress. They've actually previously been under enforcement or looking to go under enforcement again, and they're estimating the cost of implementing the requirements of their consent decree to be like $5 billion. And the small town of Corpus Christi was getting up near $1 billion at $800 million. So we definitely knew that these were expensive price tags, and we preferred to kind of figure out our fate rather than the Department of Justice figure out our fate for us. This is kind of a graphic that shows, it's produced by the Circle of Blue, and it shows what the average monthly bills are for people around the country. And it's composed of what is included in their water bill, their sewer bill, and also stormwater. So it's got the three different components there combined. And if you look kind of around here, we're around $110, $111 a month, which is actually pretty average and a little bit on the low end of things when you kind of look around the country and see what folks are paying for their water services. If you look at the two most expensive communities shown on this map, they are the city of Seattle and then Atlanta. And if you read the caption associated with those right there around Seattle, I'll read it for you. It says, Seattle and Atlanta have the highest total monthly bills. Each is building costly underground storage facilities and treatment plants to comply with the federal requirements to reduce raw sewage that is dumped into lakes and rivers. So the communities that have the highest bills and the ratepayers that are having to pay those bills, that's directly attributed to these communities having to go through the implementation associated with consent decrees. So we knew we didn't want that. So we started really trying to gain an understanding of what's the EPA really after? What are their concerns? And there was a handful of concerns that really floated to the top. One was regional coordination. They wanted additional coordination beyond what had been happening between the wholesale provider and the retail provider, so between the district and the cities. They saw that there needed to be coordination beyond what was currently happening. Another item was joint capacity management for the regional system. So historically, when we have looked at what the capacity requirements are for either interceptors or for treatment plants, we've each looked at what's happening within our system, done rainfall monitoring and flow monitoring, and assessed those things to be able to figure out what do we need to do from a capacity standpoint. And we've done that independently in the past. And so what they were looking for was more joint capacity management between the cities and the wholesale provider, the district. They also were wanting comprehensive CMOM implementation. So CMOM is Capacity Management, Operations, and Maintenance, and we'll go through that in a little bit more detail here in a moment, to prevent sanitary sewer overflows by both the district and the communities. And they were looking for ongoing system maintenance. In particular, they were really interested in, do you understand the condition of your infrastructure? And are you doing cleaning to maintain it? And are you doing rehabilitation where you've got problems that are being identified through those condition assessments? So that's kind of the items that were of the biggest concerns to the EPA. If you look at kind of the bar chart in the bottom right of this slide, it breaks out the various asset classes within the conveyance system by how much of it is owned by the district versus how much is owned by the various communities. And you can see that 95% of the pipes are owned by the communities, 97% of the manholes, and 83% of the lift stations. So it's really important that we work together to really be able to assess our system and operate and maintain our system in a way that is going to allow us to achieve our mission on a day-to-day basis. So CMOM, we've talked about that a couple of times now. So CMOM is actually, it stands for Capacity Management, Operations, and Maintenance. And it's a framework that was developed by the EPA back in the early 2000s. And what the EPA desired to do at that time was to mandate that all utilities around the country actually put together CMOM plans and execute those plans. There was a lot of industry backlash associated with putting new requirements on the utilities without additional funding available to implement those requirements. So the approach that's been taken since that time is really requiring that these type plans be developed and implemented through enforcement actions. So the EPA was not able to get that to be a requirement, so they look for either voluntary participation or they'll have you do it through an enforcement action. So when we talk about what the items are, it basically is holistically, how do you operate and maintain your system? It's a very broad set of plan that talks about under capacity, how are you doing flow monitoring, are you doing hydraulic modeling, what's the parameters under which you're assessing your system. On the management side of things, are you providing proper training to your staff with succession planning, with being able to make sure that you're going to have qualified staff to operate and maintain that system into the future. Fats, oils, and grease is a major problem in wastewater systems where people are putting things down their wastewater lines that they shouldn't, which causes a majority of the overflows that actually happen within the community systems. On the operations side, when you do have a sanitary sewer overflow occur, how do you respond to that? What's your written procedure and your processes to respond to that, and then to be able to track your performance over time? On the maintenance side of things, it's maintenance management system. It's condition assessment. Are you going out? Do you understand the condition of your buried infrastructure? And do you have proactive cleaning plans in place? So when we talk about CMOM, that actually gets to be a very common term in our industry. Many of y'all are probably familiar with it. It's a holistic approach to how you really take care of your system proactively and sustainably so that it can provide reliable service for many decades to come. All right, so we kind of went through a stepwise approach to understand what are the EPA's concerns and then put some things in place to be able to respond to those concerns. The first thing was we needed to talk more. We needed more regional collaboration than what we had at that time. So we started meeting on a regular basis. Prior to the inspections occurring, we met on the water side of the house. We met regularly, especially in times of drought, to talk about what water supply availability looked like. But we weren't regularly meeting with our customers, our member cities and customer cities to coordinate how we work together on the wastewater side of things. So we began meeting monthly with them, and since things have died down, we've gone to every other month, but we established a regional collaboration mechanism. The next thing that we did is we developed corrective action plans for each of our systems. So following the inspections that were done by EPA, they basically outlined for us in a written document what were the deficiencies that they saw. And so we had that written down, and we went through and developed corrective action plans to say, here's how we're going to respond to those deficiencies. Oftentimes when the EPA comes in and does inspections, people close up and become very guarded because there's concern that those are going to be, that whatever you say is going to be used against you. We took a little bit different of an approach than most utilities do, and that we really opened up and said, you know, the things that you pointed out, those are things that we need to do, and we need to work on that. So we put together corrective action plans, and we shared those corrective action plans with our member cities, with the EPA. The cities also put them together and shared those as they felt appropriate. And then we met regularly with EPA. At first, we started off going and meeting in D.C. with the enforcement folks in Washington, D.C. to make sure that we were addressing their concerns. As time went on, they said, I think you're okay. You may not need to meet with us, but how about you continue to provide updates to the region? So we were able to transition from meeting regularly with the folks in D.C. To instead doing that here at Region 6 in Dallas. Which was a huge step because it was an indication that, hey, maybe we're not going to need to go that consent decree route. So that was a very positive step. As we went through these regular meetings, we actually took our cities along. So we didn't just go and report back on what we were hearing from them, report back to the cities what we were hearing from EPA, but we wanted them to hear directly from the EPA what direction were we being provided by them. And then we also wanted those cities who had also been inspected to be able to provide updates to EPA on how they're responding to their inspections. And then we formalized our commitment to a regional solution. So we executed a memorandum of understanding with the district and our 12 member cities that basically said that we're committed to working together to develop a model regional CMOM program. So this was something that provided a tangible document. In many cases, it was taken to boards or councils, and in some cases, the city manager already had the authority to sign it. But it was a tangible way for the EPA to know that, hey, we all are on board and we're committed to working together. What we're really wanting to do is have a forum where we could work together and figure out what is our desired outcomes of this inspection. Us at the utility level know, and those that are utility managers, we often know what we need to do, but we don't have the funding resources to make it happen. And so we knew that this, in some ways, was a chance to be able to escalate the need to our governing bodies and talk with them about what is needed to be able to meet EPA's expectations and be able to provide that reliable service. And so we wanted a chance to be able to work together, the 13 of us, to figure out what's our desired outcomes from this. And the model program that was developed to provide consistency between how we're doing things amongst us, but understands that there's unique implementation requirements within each community. If you're a community that was built primarily in the 60s and you've got 80% clay pipe in your system, your needs are going to be a lot different than a community that has been built since 2000 and is almost all PVC pipe. So the communities, there's quite a big variation in what the needs are, and so we understood that those implementation requirements were going to be very different between them. So regional collaboration avoided consent decrees, but required CMOM implementation. So we talked before about there was 3 potential outcomes that could have occurred, and the least desired was consent decree. Well, 0 of the 13 parties got a consent decree, so that was a very good news story. There was 6 of the parties that received a letter, and what those letters said was that continued participation in the regional approach is expected, and that CMOM development and implementation is also expected. So basically those 6 entities were able to demonstrate to the EPA that, hey, we know what we need to do, and we're going to move on and do it without you having to put us under an enforcement order. There were 7 parties of the 13 that did receive administrative orders. Those were issued by EPA Region 6, and they expected that continued participation in the regional approach would occur, And then they required that those cities develop a CMOM plan within a 12-month period. So those were developed by the end of last year, 2016, so we're coming up on almost a full year since those were developed. What was something that was really cool and neat to see everybody come together is all 13 parties basically said, hey, we're going to do what those that got the AOs were required to do. So of those 6 parties that received the letters, they went ahead and developed their CMOM plans and as well, even though they weren't necessarily required to do so. So there's a number of written documents that were produced out of this. We have talked in the MOU about there was this regional CMOM plan, and that's kind of what's shown at the center of this diagram. So the regional CMOM plan basically documents the linkages between the district and the communities for things like how do we jointly manage capacity? How are we going to do our KPI reporting at the end of the year? Those types of things. And then each individual entity developed their own plan that is applicable to how they operate and maintain their system. So how did we have consistency between these? So if everybody kind of goes out, 13 parties, we're going to do this quick. A year's pretty fast to develop a real comprehensive plan for how you manage your system. So we've kind of put some things in place to help bring that consistency that we're looking for together. The first was a CMOM outline, and for those that received administrative orders, that was a 120-day submittal that was required by them. So that was something that we developed together. And then there was a model CMOM plan that basically was a guidance document that was issued at the same time as the outline, so that whenever we're talking about section 2.3, everybody's section 2.3 lines up. So it was basically a guidance document to say this is how basically the rough outline of the report. And then the CMOM plans with information that's unique to each of those communities and to the district was developed independently by those parties. So one of the things that we really spent some time doing in these routine meetings that we had was coming together on what are our objectives? What are we really here to do? And we went through some exercises where we posted things on walls and Post-it notes and tried to bring everybody together on what is the most critical things that we do. And this is what we ended up with for objectives. So the first several are really around that joint management of capacity. That was something that the EPA had picked up on and it was important to them. And as we started getting in the room and kind of workshopping this stuff to death, we kind of found the same thing. So the very first thing on the list is identify, evaluate, and address areas of excessive inflow and infiltration in the wastewater collection system. That's I&I inflow and infiltration is something that we really struggle with in the industry, and when we're having to convey and treat excessive amounts of stormwater during those storm events, it really strains our system. So everybody recognized that was at the top of the list. There was a number of other things I won't go through in detail here, but something that I think is worth mentioning, and it's something that we're really getting going on now, is the very bottom line. Communicate with and educate the public about how their activities can impact the wastewater collection system. So we're very fortunate in the North Texas area that Dallas Water Utilities actually has done a fantastic job of this over the last few decades. They started off with the Cease the Grease campaign back, I think, in the 90s, and then modified that program in the last several years to be Defend Your Drains, to where it's not just about grease, but it's also about not putting wipes down the toilet, or pharmaceuticals, or household cleaners, those types of things. So Dallas Water Utilities put together this great program that's gotten a lot of traction over the last several years. They recently entered in, I think about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, they started working with NETCOG, North Central Texas Council of Governments, to roll this same campaign out regionally and not just with Dallas Water Utilities. And so within the North Texas area in our member and customer cities, we've tried to, we had a different workshop to talk about how do we educate the public, and something that was very clear was we need a common message. We need the same people to hear the same things, even if it's coming from different parties. So we're really trying to embrace these other regional campaigns that are in place and build upon that and try to spread that same message. And that's something that we're really pulling in the public education folks, the communicators, the PIO type folks to try to get some of that stuff out. All right, so a few examples on what's included in the regional CMOM coordination plan. It really documents those linkages between the district and our cities, and there's a few standard operating procedures that have been put in place. One is the request for wastewater connections and point of entry protocol. So when we look at our conveyance system, there's over 500 points where cities are discharging into our interceptors, and we haven't always documented those in a consistent way. And so this protocol is really trying to get some consistency and process for how we're doing our daily business so that we have that information available to us. Another thing that's really critical is the hydraulic modeling SOP. And then the notification of flow diversion and outage. There are times when either the city can negatively impact the district system or the district can negatively impact the city system, and so we've got a protocol in place to be able to document those occurrences. So we've got our plans in place. We completed ours about a little end of last year, and we've wanted to give you guys just a glimpse at some of the major initiatives that we've been doing in year one to implement our plan. So one of the things is lift station condition assessment. We've got 23 lift stations that convey flow from the communities into our treatment plants, and they had not ever had a real thorough condition assessment conducted on them. The operators look at them regularly. If something's broke, we know to fix it, but we had never really gone through and done a thorough condition assessment. So the way that we went about doing that was starting off with just a rapid assessment. So we had an engineering consulting firm that was helping us through this. They brought in their experts. We went around to every one of those lift stations, bumped the pumps to see if they were having vibration issues, went and looked at all of them in a rapid fashion, and then identified which ones do we need to look in more detail at from a vibration standpoint. So we did detailed vibration testing of 7 of those lift stations based on those rapid assessments, and then we also did more detailed field assessment of primarily the mechanical components that rather than the architectural components is where we really focused. We were able to use that information to prioritize the needs for capital investment, and we'll be nominating those to put them into our capital improvements plan. Something else that we did as we went through this is in order to really do a good job at condition assessment, you got to pull together a lot of historical information. You got to look at the design plans, you got to look at the O&M manuals for the various pumps you got. There's a lot of information, and that information often sits on bookshelves static. And so we use this as an opportunity to develop lift station specific O&M manuals. And we put those in electronic format to where our operators who are out in the field can have access to those through their iPads. So now our operators have access to all the critical information about each individual lift station and how it functions. Another thing that we did, so that was the lift stations are more on the vertical side of things for vertical assets. On the linear assets, we also began a pipeline condition assessment program, and we have a goal to essentially assess all of our pipelines on a 10-year cycle, so we need to do about 10% of them a year. So we got a really good running start at that this last year, and we set up our program to be able to manage that data in an effective way. When you start doing this inspection work, previous to this, we had somebody whose desk drawer was full of CDs. They just had a whole desk drawer full of CDs and of CCTV data, and it wasn't really accessible very practically. So when we started this off, we said, okay, we need to do this to where we're going to have access to that information. We can really use it, and it's visible to the folks that need it to be visible to. So we got that program in place. We decided to go beyond the traditional CCTV. The traditional route to doing a program like this is you clean every foot of your pipe so that you can see what's going on in it, and then you stick your closed caption TV through it, CCTV, and you look and see what you can see visually, and you score it based on what you can see visually. What we decided to do was a little bit different. What we decided to do was instead inspect first and clean where needed. And the inspection technologies that we're using are much more advanced than the typical CCTV. It does have high definition CCTV as a part of it, but it also has sonar data. So the bottom picture there is kind of a picture of the sonar data where you can actually see how much debris is within that pipe. Do you need to clean that pipe based on the amount of debris that's in there? And then it also uses a laser to be able to take laser imaging of the top of the pipe above the water surface elevation to understand in, say, a concrete pipe, how much deterioration has occurred. How much of your pipe wall have you lost? So we're using more advanced technologies where you get that visual feel, but you also get the more advanced information to be able to look at how your assets are aging over time. So we're going through our baseline conditions right now, and it'll take a number of years to get through that. But when we get the second pass through, you'll actually be able to start calculating what's the rate of deterioration within those pipe walls. All right, so let's see. Another major implementation initiative is on the capacity assessment side. We've said a number of times we need to jointly manage that capacity. So the first step in what we've been working on this past year is historically we've only modeled our infrastructure within our hydraulic model. But as part of this program, we're going up into the city system and actually modeling a portion of their system where those critical interfaces occur. It's going to be a multi-year process to be able to get through all of that work. We're going to be doing flow monitoring this next spring to really start understanding what kind of system response are we seeing. And then by 2019, 2020, we can start actually making decisions on, are we going to continue to upsize to convey all of the stormwater? Or are we going to try to eliminate some of that stormwater from getting into the system and not have to increase the capacity of the regional system as much? All right, so the collaborative regional approach has yielded some positive results. It's allowed local utilities to determine the necessary investments to provide safe, affordable, and reliable services. We know what we need to do within our systems, and we have been able to continue to figure that out rather than having others out of Washington, D.C. tell us what we need to do. We've also got a framework in place to avoid future enforcement by implementing sustainable practices. So if we all go out and execute our plans, we'll probably be in pretty good shape. So we've got that framework in place. We met with the EPA in January to basically share the results of what we had done the previous year, and this is the feedback we received. They were very impressed with the coordination, communication, and the commitment that has been demonstrated by the district and the cities, but there was some concern that each community would get the funding that they need. So they did indicate they'll be doing some follow-up inspections, and they would be available to write us administrative orders as needed. But they did think that we're very close to being sustainable, and that's really what we need to do, is be able to provide that sustainable, reliable service. So there's been a number of parties that have been involved in this work over the last few years, and it's really been a tremendous effort by many to be able to come together. You can see the 12 cities that are there. We've also got the EPA shown because they were willing to give us a chance to try to figure this out on our own, and we appreciate that. And we've had a couple of consultants that have helped us through this as well, CH2M and pipeline analysis. So with that, I think that kind of wraps up what I had prepared. I don't know, y'all may not have time for questions.
Let's do